test is going on right now. Some of you may be following the Recall Judge Persky efforts that are going on right here in Northern California. We're in Northern California, but right here in California, going on just north of us, that Judge Persky was the judge who imposed the 6-month sentence on Brock Turner out of the Stanford case. And that he was released after 2 months. That case has gotten a lot of notoriety. A Stanford law professor by the name of Michelle Dauber has led an effort to recall Judge Persky. If she's successful, what kind of message will that send to judges about sentencing? Right? That has to be one of the things that we're also thinking about, and whether that's a positive benefit or not. I mean, it's great with Stanford. Brock Turner got a lot of notoriety. The reality is that rapists get 6 months and lesser sentences in American courtrooms every single half hour in this country. But yet we chose Brock Turner as the poster child for why that wasn't okay. And so it's a reform movement that may start in Santa Clara County, but which could have much broader repercussions.
I think one of the things that makes it difficult to have this kind of discussion is that a lot of the information that we would need to know to have an informed discussion is happening behind closed doors. So Title IX proceedings are for the most part secret and only become publicized when they go to trial, usually when a son and an accused person brings a civil case. And it's worth knowing you have to actually be rich to bring a civil case. Like it costs like at least $100,000 and up to $1 million for somebody who feels, usually it's a man who's been falsely accused, to bring a civil suit against his school. So that's all happening behind closed doors. We don't know the kinds of stuff and the ways Title IX officers are making decisions, although I wrote about this in my book Unwanted Advances because I got access to a trove of information about these cases on my campus. And it's the same off campus now with HR officers making these sorts of decisions behind closed doors. So one of the things that I've learned, because so many people started coming to me with these cases, is that it's not rape, and it's not, even like sort of pro sexual harassment where like a teacher says sleep with me and I'll give you a good grade. There are many different levels of sorts of things that are now being called crimes on campus, and I think in office situations as well, like making a joke somebody doesn't like, making eye contact. I've seen a lot of cases come up where somebody makes eye contact somebody doesn't like, a professor and a student. Texting, a case I wrote about where an undergrad sent text messages which turned into sexting to a grad student, and this led to a 6-month investigation. So part of what's happening, I know this from the on-campus situation, is that sex is being criminalized, and all versions of sex that somebody is made uncomfortable by are being criminalized. And like I said before, the people on the receiving end of this are not just the sex criminals. It's not just Harvey Weinstein. It's like undergrads who have bad communication in a sexual encounter. Or here's a case that I learned about recently, a gay man who was a staff person at a college in the East Coast who supervised undergraduates. He was the head of the student activities office. He was gay. Everybody got together and talked about their social lives on Monday. And some of the students were made uncomfortable because he was talking about dating men. So they pressed a hostile environment lawsuit or a Title IX suit against him. So the hostile environment that he created was created because he was a gay man, and his sexuality made those students uncomfortable. In HR situations now, companies are going through and doing these sweeps where they're interviewing employees and asking, is there anybody here that makes you uncomfortable? And those people are asked to work off campus, off site, work from home. In the cases that I've been hearing about, at least 2 people were disabled men. So their sexuality made people uncomfortable. One was a bisexual woman. I think she made people uncomfortable because her sexual affect, was just something other people were uncomfortable with. So I think we just have to be aware that there's a lot of stuff going on that's filtering down from these much needed rectifications of sexual, business as usual, that is affecting people at all levels and for often incredibly minor stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it as well. I don't know how prevalent it is, but a colleague of mine who's a dean of students, he's been in his career 22 years, he served his institution very ably. He facilitated an RA training last year. And in the RA training, he showed a slide that put up the 1 in 5 statistic, and then he also put up a study that gave a different statistic as a counterpoint. And his statement to the RAs was, I don't agree with the statistic, the study that is a counterpoint. I think 1 in 5 is more accurate, but you all need to be aware that there are people out there who don't believe in rape culture, who believe that the statistics are false, and they will bring forward that particular perspective. Well, 2 RAs ran out of the room in tears because they were triggered by anybody challenging the assertion of how prevalent sexual violence was on college campuses, and one of those students filed a Title IX complaint against the Dean of Students for sharing the fact that there's more than one statistic on the frequency of sexual violence. And he had to hire an attorney, and he had to tell his wife what he was going through, and he was put on suspension, and ultimately he was cleared. So justice is done in the end. But we also need to be asking the question, what kind of system permits a Title IX complaint for something like that? That's all there was to the substance of it.
I should say the gay guy that I mentioned, the student activities director, lost his job. He was found guilty of creating a hostile environment.
I wondered if you could just comment a little bit. On the one hand, there's this one way to think about social media, it being and taking people down is it's a little like in medieval times. We gather in the square and watch, people get burned and the pleasure of that. But I was thinking that there's this other counterpoint to that, which is, relying on the justice system that's failed so many people. It has driven people to try to find the means that they can to expose and try to find some way to make it safe. And so, rather than just, it's not that I don't see it's dangerous, but rather than just seeing its dangers and saying, oh, that's such an appropriate way to expose people, no one's addressing the fact of what's driving people to that is that they can't get justice. And this is why on college campuses, Title IX is going in this direction, because they feel like, well, that's a place, since you can't go to the courts, we can pursue this on campus. But then the worry on the other side is that, but then you have, school administrators, making these decisions and behind closed doors, which is exactly the bullshit was going on in the justice system that made people feel like they couldn't get justice. So I wonder if that might get into things.
I have plenty to say. I just think that we can name these single stories of the system not working and of people manipulating the system. But that is not the majority of the cases that are being brought in front of Title IX boards. And that's not the majority of accusations. And of course, one innocent man in jail is too many. But that's not where we're at. And I have empathy for people in these situations who are actually being marginalized for different reasons, like for homophobia. So let's talk about homophobia, which is the real problem. The real problem is not dealing with Title IX. And so changing how we talk about and how we see homosexuality is really, that's where that battle lies. And to diminish the importance of repercussions for sexual violence and using homophobia as a shield for that is really troubling and problematic. And I also think that, social media can be a cesspool, and nobody knows more about social media being a cesspool than I think I'm fairly comfortable saying me as a Black bisexual woman who's overweight. I get it from all angles at all times of the day, no matter what, even on Christmas. And so I know that there is this idea that there is this spectacle of bringing people down and call out culture. but call-out culture exists because it works. And sometimes social media justice, for lack of a better phrase, is the only justice that people have available to them. And I think we have to look at how desperate people have become that they turn to this form of justice. That's how abandoned they have been by the traditional justice system. And so it can be distressing to see someone who is being called out in an uncomfortable way. I'm reminded of, I think her name was Justine Sacco. She made this AIDS joke several years ago and then got on a plane to Africa. And when she landed, she had lost her job. And I wrote an essay on at the time saying that, you know, it was blown out of proportion and the sort of torch burning was a bit much. But she was the daughter of a billionaire. And Justine is fine. We just always seem to be hanging these causes on the wrong people, the people who are going to end up being just fine. And I don't know, I think we just need to think more carefully about worrying about social media justice and that sort of thing, and look at the why of it more than what's actually happening.
Great, so I'm gonna turn to our last question, and then we'll have a lot of time for people to come up and ask things, which is, it seems like it would be a shame to leave the room without at least hearing some advice about what you think people in the room could do to positively contribute to the movement in a variety of ways. And the people in the room are not just students, because students are not just students, they're also workers. They're employers, they're employees, there's staff people here, there's faculty here, we're citizens, you know, we have all these different roles. And so when I say what we can do, like in these different aspects of our lives, like how do you think we can actually make a difference? Like what can you actually do instead of just being witnesses to what's going on? Thoughts about that?
You can believe women. I very much believe that. I think that we can hold each other accountable when thinking about what consent looks like and having more robust and broad conversations that are open and that allow people to be fallible when we talk about what consent looks like and how we may not know. One of the things I hear most often on my campus is, I didn't know. And I actually believe that to be true, that there are lots of people across the gender spectrum who simply don't know what active and enthusiastic consent looks like, and who don't know that no means no, and that stop means stop. And so I think if we hold each other accountable in our day-to-day lives more effectively and have more open conversations, we can contribute to evolving into a culture where we move beyond this point where there's so much murkiness, where people are just so confused about what consent is and where the lines are.
I think that I would like to see people adopting other kinds of models for justice than only the punitive model. I mean, we've all been, you know, in various ways asking for more nuance, and you know, one of the critiques of what's happened on campus, and I think it's also happening increasingly off campus now, is that it's following what's called a carceral model, like, you know, where imprisonment is the form of justice. And I think, you know, that's affecting how Title IX is happened on campus, and I think it's now happening off campus too, where people are just sort of expelled from their jobs, which is a sort of social death. If you're, you know, deprived of your income over something that might have been, you know, 5 years ago, a sort of minor transgression. So, you know, for a long time, I think that under Title IX, mediation wasn't involved. I think that the OCR is moving away from that now. So more conversations, more mediation, more a move away from punishment and toward, you know, there's the like model truth and reconciliation commissions in various sorts of places. Because, I mean, what I think universities and colleges should be about is education as opposed to punishment. And we've let the administrators take, kind of hijack both movements and momentum and this need for justice and redress for sexually, you know, violative kinds of incidents, and, you know, move in the most expedient ways, like expelling people from campus, criminalizing situations where, you know, there were oftentimes just misunderstandings. So I think looking toward other models than punitive, carceral, ones, you know, in ones in which people are educating each other, as I think we're saying, is what I would hope for moving forward.
I have two things I'll say. Use the privilege that you have. Everybody in the room has some form of privilege to make room for others who don't share that privilege, right? There's a great article that just came out this week about male survivors and how we can make room for them in the Me Too movement. They have their own tagline, it's not even Me Too, because they want to be recognized and have society realize in many ways how much more difficult it is for them. And so whatever your privilege happens to be, no, that's their position, I'm not saying it's my position. And so I hope that we can make for a bigger tent, is one of the ways that I hope your activism will manifest. The other, I hope, is a much more macro concept, which is that almost all of the institutions of our society that try to resolve these allegations of misconduct are self-dealing. Every college has a vested interest in the outcome of an accusation. Every corporation has a good reason to cover up for the Harvey Weinsteins of the world. And if we are willing as a generation to insist that these organizations stop self-dealing, we can begin to become more objective in how we address things, whether it's a carceral model or not. I think ultimately we can't even get to a tenable discussion of what model to use when the prevailing model is cover-up because an institution is self-interested in the outcome. And that's why the criminal justice model was supposed to be an alternative. But that doesn't mean there aren't other third-party neutral models that we as a society should be talking about and thinking about.
Can you describe some?
Well, a great example would be something along the lines of the model of FINRA. I don't know if any of you are studying economics, but there is an agency organized on the auspices of the Securities and Exchange Commission that polices the ethics of every securities dealer in this country. They have 600,000 members, and when a securities dealer engages in fraudulent practices, they police them. They take their license, they shut it down. It's a very activist, third-party neutral, respected organization because it doesn't have a profit motive and it holds everybody to a standard of industry accountability and ethics. Why couldn't we create a FINRA for sexual violence and sexual harassment?
Describe a little bit what that would look like.
Well, those who are talking about this believe in something like a regional center model, where either through colleges or government agencies, I'm not sure exactly how they would fund this and make a go of it, but individuals who are impartial, have no connection to the institutions that they're investigating, would engage in the investigation and resolution of what otherwise is an internal HR or a Title IX matter for colleges and employers.
Can we move to Q&A and start getting people's feedback? So there's a microphone here, and there's a microphone there, and I think my job is just to point. Come right to that microphone. Come and stand there and use the microphone. And, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You guys can line up.
Line up. The microphone here. So we're gonna start right here.
Ooh,
Yeah.
here we go.
And if you feel like saying
No.
here we go.
It's been an interesting dynamic.
Is it? Yes. Can you guys hear me? Yes. I can get closer. Okay. Yeah, I am a senior at the moment. My name is Kay. First of all, hello, Roxanne, you're amazing. Thank you for being here. Yeah, so as someone who has been accused of sexual assault by the man who actually raped me, I can say for a fact that being raped was a far more traumatic experience. Additionally, from what I've seen, is that what happened to me is like one of the most common forms of false accusations, counter accusations from predators in order to prolong the process and silence survivors. So if this, like false accusation, is the unintended consequence of
survivors of violence being believed. I'm pretty down for that, especially given that we live in a country in which Black people are falsely accused of doing anything at all and murdered for it daily. I think that this issue is less of a problem. I'm not really concerned about white men being humiliated. But yeah, so the process is really traumatic. I was not automatically believed by any stretch of the imagination, and telling others remains difficult, even as a pretty vocal survivor. And like, you're saying that telling others is like somehow comparable to assaulting someone, of like, you're framing it as like a vindictive thing, when actually public shaming is so necessary for the safety of a community, especially a small community. And like, calling it a private issue is rape culture, and trying to keep that a private issue is rape culture. So I'm just, yeah. People just want to be safe and comfortable, and going to school with your rapist is possibly like the most hostile learning environment. And so like, you are asking survivors to go to school with their rapist when survivors consistently drop out, transfer, fail out in that situation. So why are you prioritizing predators' success in education over survivors, is my question.
I think that distorts what I was saying. In so many ways that it would be hard to know where to start. I have no interest in protecting people who commit criminal acts, and rape is a criminal act. There are a lot of complicated questions about whether rapists should be tried on campus. One of the problems is there's no fact-finding capability. If you are accused of, I'm not sure what you're accused of, but one of the problems in these campus adjudications is that they don't have sufficient ways to determine, in the way that like a police investigation might, or optimally might, what actually happened. So, these are kind of complicated questions, and what I guess I am trying to do is complicate and add some of the nuances to this. Yes, I understand that depending on where you're situated, you might not want to allow that there are many situations that are not so straightforward as somebody was raped and somebody did it. Many, and I think Brad has written about this in his newsletter, many of the situations that come forward are far more murky than that. They're like two people who were drunk, and one person later accuses the other person of something, and nobody was there, and nobody knows what happened.
The survivor was there.
Determining it. So the situations are complicated. Sex is kind of oftentimes messy, not straightforwardly there's a victim and a perpetrator. So that's part of the nuance of this.
Well, we're talking about believing survivors, and survivors don't say, like, I was assaulted when a situation was murky.
Actually, I don't think that's true. I think there are plenty of situations, and that's as you start reading the cases, you may know a couple of situations from your local, in your local circle, but if you start reading the cases that are going forward, there are plenty of cases like that, of somebody who's disappointed romantically after a breakup, somebody 6 months later or a year later. Listen, this is true. Accuses someone of assault. These are the kinds of cases that are being decided on campus.
Follow-up to that, but I think you're gonna have a fun time tonight. But so we're talking about fear of a culture where fear of a culture where murky sex or where eye contact or whatever, or someone being drunk can make a person's career go down, and like we're talking about this and being scared of it, but like as an advocate myself, someone who raised their hand in the beginning, and as a survivor myself, like we're taught that if things aren't law and order style stranger rape while you're walking back to your campus, they aren't assault, and like your viewpoint is validating that, and that's used to like silence so many survivors who do have kind of things that aren't the crazy sensationalized forms of violence that happen to us. And even then, Ms. Skye, to your point, like we know what bodily autonomy is. Like, women know when their boundaries are crossed. I learned body autonomy when I learned, I don't know, potty training. So it's like, right? So it's just like, if we're scared of creating this culture, where men are afraid of smiling at women and different things, like, I think that's what the Me Too movement is about. It's about creating like a healthy fear. You know, I feel like it is. Like, if we show that these things do have repercussions, and you know, I'm not losing any sleep over people having healthy fear of destroying lives. Like, people are old enough to know, people are mature enough to know when their boundaries have been crossed and when they're crossing boundaries. That was a question, that was a statement, I'm sorry.
That was a very nice statement. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I agree, people know. And when people work up the courage to go to a university, for example, and say, I was raped, they're not saying I had regrettable sex. They're not saying I was drunk and I'm confused. They're saying I was raped. And I do think, you know, Laura, I do understand where you're coming from. I absolutely do, and I'm a Libra. So I am always, I'm always listening to all sides, and you know, I'm always accused of being a centrist, and I am a centrist, and I'm very okay with that. But not on this subject. I think that it's great that there's someone out there who's worrying, I guess, about you know, men feeling uncomfortable. But I think it's about time that men understood how many women feel moving through the world and dealing with all sorts of boundary encroaching. And I trust humanity enough to believe that we are not going to devolve into a world where you can't smile at each other and not go to jail. I just trust that we're going to be able to work this out equitably somehow.
Here's maybe a counterfactual to think about. Here's a case at my own university, Northwestern, which is now in the courts. Okay, there was two undergrads who were in a committed relationship. He was an 18-year-old freshman, she was a sophomore, a year older. They had had sex numerous times. There was one occasion where I guess he asked her for oral sex, maybe twice. She wasn't really into it, but she sort of started to do it. Then he realized she wasn't into it, she stopped, went on for 30 seconds or so. There was a breakup, a lot of dispute. 6 months later, she pressed a Title IX suit against him saying that act of oral sex wasn't consensual. It went through a hearing. He was found guilty by a committee of student deans of emotional coercion, and he was kicked out of school. So he could reapply in 2 years, but his, your transcript is frozen, that sort of thing. This was somebody, I interviewed him. I mean, this was somebody, he went into, you don't have to feel sorry for him. He was a white guy. But, his life was really kind of wrecked for a while. The question to me becomes, why is the school deciding that he is the responsible one in that situation? We can, we can sort of sloganize about, we know where our boundaries are and that sort of thing. I mean, the facts in this look like this was somebody who was sort of pissed off about a breakup and 6 months later decided that 30-second episode was worth getting this kid kicked out of school over. So it's gone to a civil suit because his parents had enough money to sue the school over this. So these are the kinds of cases, and I know Brett knows about this because he's a consultant for this. These are the kinds of cases. They're not straightforward cases of assault. They're murky cases where, there's a disagreement about what happened and who was responsible.
Okay, I have a lot to say about that, but I have a different question written down, so I'm gonna go with that one. This is a question for anyone who wants to answer it, but my question is related to Professor Tannenbaum's previous statement about the role of the justice system in the process of recourse for survivors.
Do you all think legal recourse is the best way to address and prevent sexual assault and harassment? Undocumented women and women of color who are victims of crimes are systemically rejected and often even criminalized by our justice system when they come forward with accusations. How can we expect this system to be the best way to help these women who may not be able to use the media to address their assaulters? What are the other courses of action that you think we can use to support, that we can use to support survivors that avoid engaging with police and systems of incarceration? Should reforming the patriarchal/racist justice system be an integral part of the Me Too movement?
Well articulated question, thank you. I hope that all of you have a chance to look at the work that Mary Koss is doing right now in Arizona. Many of you know that she's done some of the very first studies of the prevalence of sexual violence in our society. Now she's engaged in a project to help the criminal justice system in Phoenix to incorporate more restorative justice practices. And so my default answer to your question is always, whatever system the survivor seems to prefer is what I'd like to see utilized, but I'd like more options on the table. And as I've looked across all of the different mechanisms, I'm not a big fan of mediation. I think that restorative justice has the most potential, if it's voluntary, if it's sincere, for catharsis, than any other resolution.
What restorative justice means?
Sure. Restorative justice is an offender accountability program that doesn't focus entirely on punishment, but on how do you make the person and community you've harmed whole again based on the hurt that you've caused. And so in situations where you have the willingness of an offender to be accountable, the question isn't, can you pay somebody and write them a check? Right? The question is, how do you make this a safe community for them? How do you make them feel trust again? How can you help to put them to give back what you've taken away? And so I think where that's sincere and the parties are willing, acting freely, not coerced, I think there's an opportunity potentially for catharsis there. I also think there's a potential there for abuse. But I think it's worth experimenting more with programs like the one that Mary is helping to pioneer to see if that can be something that makes the criminal justice system more user-friendly to survivors who aren't even willing to approach it at this point sometimes.
Okay, so sweetness before I get to the bitterness. Before anything else, I'd like to say, fellow bi person. Bi pride, wonderful to hear that. Did not know that. So happy to know that. So my name is Angela. I go by she, just in case any of you try and preemptively refer to me as he, cutting that off right now. So I'm curious, sort of, as in thinking about all of these different things, this is, I'm sorry again to Laura, this is probably going to be more of a question directed to you, but also in thinking about a lot of the things I've been hearing from all the panelists. It seems as though there's been this theme of like intellectual rigor, getting into the complexities of these situations, of talking about these different cases, and this might be more directed to Laura, as I said before, but you were mentioning details of these cases, but it also brought up a couple other cases and such, where it seems like there's a lot of crucial elements being left out in the evaluation of them, because you mentioned the homosexual man's case, you didn't bring up details as to what was said in the allegations that is being cited as evidence, you didn't bring up those kinds of details in terms of you're employing the term like facts, which to my knowledge is said to be something that stands outside of like any given interpretation, but we're working in a sphere that inevitably involves human interpretation, in which that's going to be murky, and it seems as though you're striving for a certain level of intellectual rigor, which you yourself are not employing in this case in describing some of these circumstances. So I'm just kind of asking a sort of clarification of what exactly do you mean in wanting to talk about intellectual rigor in these cases? Like, what does that mean in terms of what would be worthwhile evidence? Because I've heard all of the panelists talk about this concern about if we just get it down to social media level, then it becomes a witch hunt, which all of the issues aside with employing that term. What exactly would your standard for evidence be, or what would you like the standard for evidence to be? And do you think that can exist given how much people have touched upon it outside of carceral methods? Because you seem to be thinking outside of the box in some of your comments about looking towards something a little bit outside of carceral, and yet seem relatively conservative and traditionalist in a lot of your interpretation of these situations. So I'm curious about this contradiction that seems to be coming up in your own thinking. And I'm curious for all of the panelists, what do you think is a worthwhile standard of evidence for these cases when we're working with something that's incredibly human evaluative? It's very dependent on just, we're working with humans who have structural oppression, structural programming that tells them certain ways to look at the situation. And hopefully, I might be reading your comment a little bit poorly, but maybe have a little more grasp of the situation, have a complex enough grasp of the situation to not just be mad at a white guy, because I find that rather insulting personally, because it seemed like a bit of a bait for you to bring that up. And I'm curious, how would you handle the situation? What is your standard of evidence for these cases, especially for marginalized folk like trans folk or people of color?
Well, that's a huge number of questions that you've asked, but I think
We have time.
Not that much time.
For you.
You pointed some interesting contradictions that I sort of agree with you about. First of all, yeah, sure, I wasn't providing footnotes or a lot of detail in the anecdotes that I was offering. Part of the reason I was offering them is that I kind of get the sense that there's a narrative, a sort of singular narrative that's maybe commonly believed here or held to be true, and I was just trying to kind of offer some counterpoints from my own experience of situations that I've learned about, because I think those are, probably because so much of this goes on behind closed doors, trying to offer you, there are other sides of this, there are multiple sides of this, and I said at the beginning, I feel that I at least have to be able to hold 12 different, contradictory views at once. So I don't